in which a small child could sleep. The room was pleasant and comfortable, but in winter it could become bitter cold. So the Wilsons slept with nightcaps on, under plenty of warm covers, and in long woolen nightshirts.
Mornings in the Wilson house started here, at the washstand. In summer, the pitcher was always filled. But in winter, water left overnight would freeze. So the two Wilson boys took turns bringing a hot supply from the kitchen fireplace.
Mrs. Wilson made the soap for her family's cleaning and washing. It wasn't too difficult, but it did take time. First, ashes from the fireplace were put into a tub out in the backyard. Over these, rainwater was poured. This dripped slowly through the barrel until it became lye water, and then drained out through a hole at the bottom of the tub. The liquid was boiled, together with waste cooking grease, and cooled. The result was soap as fine as you could buy and much cheaper.
You couldn't wash thoroughly in the small bedroom basins, so every Saturday night, down in the kitchen next to the cozy fireplace, each member of the Wilson family had a bath, an overall scrubbing for the week. The Wilsons always kept their fire going down here day and night all year round. The fire wasn't easy to start. From a tinderbox, they had to take a flintstone and hit it hard with a piece of steel until it sparked. When this happened, they had a piece of flax ready to ignite. With this, they would light a few small sticks of wood. Well, it took a long time to get a spark. So once the fire was lit, the Wilsons kept it going. At night, since they didn't want an unwatched fire to burn while they slept, they covered it very carefully with ashes before going to bed. Beneath the ashes, the fire burned safely. And in the morning, they removed the ashes, put on kindling wood, and fanned the air with a bellows until the flames sprung up again.
Had you lived in the time of the Wilsons, you'd know how important a fire was to daily life. To cook meals, to heat water, or just to keep the house warm and aired. When Mrs. Wilson wanted to light a candle,
or Mr. Wilson wanted to light his pipe,
they caught the flame here with a spill.
A spill was a stick of tightly rolled paper, most often newspaper. Paper was expensive in those days, so the flame was snuffed out right away and the spill saved for later.
At the fireplace, Mrs. Wilson also toasted bread. Her toaster could be turned to brown the slices evenly on both sides. She baked her bread and her pies in the oven next to the fireplace. This was usually a weekly chore, for it took at least 2 hours to bring the oven to baking temperature. Above the fireplace, she dried vegetables for cooking and herbs for making medicines and spices.
The family ate their meals at the table in the kitchen. This was the only room that was always warm in the winter.
And being near the fireplace meant that Mrs. Wilson didn't have to carry anything very far. For everything in the house was heavy. The firewood, the pots, the pans, the tea kettle, the poking iron, and the big buckets of water which had to be brought in from the well outside. With husbands at work and children at school, this was the woman's job. Women's chores were many in these times. Mrs. Wilson had to make her own butter. First, she'd put fresh cream into a wooden container, and then churn and churn and churn.
But then Mr. Wilson bought a new kind of churner, which hung from a rocker. Whoever walked by gave it a sharp kick. That kept the rocker going and the cream churning. Except in the large cities, most Americans of Mr. Wilson's time were farmers. But many, even while running a farm, also had a business or profession. Some were lawyers, doctors, and bankers. Fred Wilson owned the general store. Early morning, he would tend to his farm. Then, on the way to the store, at an easy pace of 4 miles an hour, he would switch from thinking like a farmer to thinking like a merchant. Fred Wilson sold everything in his store that the people of his community could want. Dry goods, household articles, china, harness equipment, tobacco. Because hard cash was rare with farmers, many customers preferred bartering to buying. They'd bring in homemade fabrics and candles or farm products and trade them for merchandise in the store, or exchange them for something that another farmer might have left for barter. Like this homemade apple peeler. The apple was placed on these nails, the knife mounted on a handle. To peel an apple, you simply turn the wheel.
This type of flat iron was relatively new then. It had a compartment to hold a piece of iron which had been hung over the fire until it was red hot. By hanging several of these fillers over the fire and replacing them in the compartment as often as needed, women did not have to stop and reheat the whole flat iron.
Hitching weights, like this one, permitted drivers to secure their horses where there were no hitching rails or posts. The driver would carry the weight with him, put it on the ground at his destination, and attach it with a strap to the bit in the horse's mouth. The weight alone couldn't stop the horse, but the strap, pulling on the bit like a rein, would keep him from running away. This weight was made by the local blacksmith, an important person in the community. He made most of the iron articles used in the houses and on the farms. Of course, what kept him busiest was making horseshoes. His shop was a gathering place for all the young boys. Many of them wanted to be blacksmiths, for this was a job for strength and muscle. But first, the smith would always tell them, go to school. Everyone should learn how to read and write. The smith was sorry he never did, but when he was a boy, there were only few schools. Since the war, since the country had become independent, there were schools everywhere.
The new schools were bright and cheerful. All of the children of the community, regardless of age or grade, were taught in the one-room schoolhouse. Ben Wilson liked school. There he learned writing on slates.
On a slate, it was easy to wipe off a mistake.
Then he learned reading from books. First, from alphabet books. Then from books on manners, on morals, on history. True historical stories were the most popular with the children. Ben Wilson's favorite was about Sir Walter Raleigh, the first person in Europe to try smoking. Not a very healthy thing to do. When Raleigh's servant saw his master smoking for the first time, he thought he was on fire and threw a bucket of water on him. That taught history and the moral. Ben's older sister, Beth, went away to a boarding school in Boston. This meant traveling, which Beth enjoyed.
Although traveling was not easy in those days, the stagecoaches were small. 3 narrow benches held 9 cramped passengers. Long trips were especially uncomfortable.
Also, most coaches started early in the morning.
Very early.
Sometimes at 5, or even at 3, or 2 o'clock. And you didn't dare be late.
Because if you were, the coach left without you.
There were no alarm clocks to rely on. So her family had to take turns staying up all night so that Beth would be awake in time.
And when she got into the coach before dawn, it was so dark that she could barely see who was sitting next to her. In those days, roads were muddy and full of ruts and holes. The coach often came dangerously close to tumbling over. The driver would call out, "Ladies and gentlemen, to the left, please," and then, "Now to the right." You can be sure that everyone quickly followed orders.
On most trips, passengers spent one or more nights in roadside taverns. Beth's trip from New York to Boston took 46 hours, with 2 nights for eating and resting at the inns.
Whenever a coach arrived at a tavern, the place was filled with waiting townspeople, eager to chat with the travelers and get the news of the day. The men ate in the tavern bar. Here the fire always burned, even in hottest summer, so that the gentlemen could light their pipes.
Ladies were not permitted where men drank. They ate in another room, their own little gossip center.
Not all traveling in those days was done on roads. You could cross a river by ferry, or travel on a steamboat. Steamboats were new then, and just beginning to open up America's great rivers to a lively passenger and freight traffic.
There were corn huskings at harvest time, and barn dances